Well, I think I'm going to get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Soil Health Nexus Digital Café. We're excited about our program today. After a holiday off, for the December off, we're glad to be back at it. I'm Paul Gross, an extension educator in Central Michigan, part of the Soil Health Nexus team, along with Christina Carell from Michigan and Anne Marie Nardi from Wisconsin, who's going to be running the controls. So with that, we'll get started and I'll advance the slide. I'd like to ask people to kind of mute your microphones if you would, please. And the Soil Health Nexus, just to describe who we are, we're a group of 12 universities in the Great Lakes region. And our goal and mission is to provide science-based knowledge on soil health, education extension resources. So we'll continue to move on. The format today is we're going to have the presentation. We'll have Q&A, and I invite everybody to put your questions in the chat. At the end, we'll start answering them. If you have one you want to answer live, we can unmute you. But at the end, we'll go into breakout rooms. You can choose which breakout room you're going into, and then we can carry on further discussion to the top of the hour or beyond. So with that, I would like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Marshall McDaniel. He's going to talk about prairies and the landscape change and notes from underground. So I'm really excited to hear what Dr. McDaniel has to say. So welcome. Marshall, and I'd ask you to share your screen and start when you're ready. So again, I'd remind everybody to put your questions in the chat.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction. Can you hear me, Paul?
Oh, yes. And your picture is phenomenal.
Great. Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to you and Anne and Christina and just inviting me to come talk to this great group of folks. And I'm looking forward to the discussion after the 20 minutes or so you've allotted me here. And I'm looking forward to questions. And so what I'm here to do is to talk about some research we've done at Iowa State, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some collaborations with Michigan State folks too on this practice called prairie strips here. And so you're looking at a photo. Paul talked about the photo here you see in front of you. This is a farm row crop of soybeans. Farmers usually plant soybeans or corn around these strips of prairie strips. And I'll talk about more about these and why farmers are really interested in this new practice. But before I dive into kind of more of the nitty-gritty details, I just want to make sure I cover my bases and acknowledge a few folks that we couldn't have made this research, and the data you'll see here wouldn't be possible without these folks. So there's a long list of folks that are part of the Iowa State Strips team. Cole Dutters, my former PhD student, he's now a postdoc in the lab. He's the one that collected most of the data and soil samples you'll see here. Lisa Schulte-Moore and Matt Helmers and Matt Liebman were kind of the originators of the STRIPS project. We have some collaborators at Michigan State, like I mentioned, Corinne Rutkowski, Sarah Evans, Nick Haddad, and folks up there that have been very collaborative and great to work with. And we've received funding from these agencies down below that also are an important part of making the work happen. And I just want to, again, point out that I get the easy job here talking to you about all the hard work that my former PhD student, now postdoc, Cole Dutter, shown here, happy under all conditions, whether he's in a hot greenhouse working on a greenhouse study or sampling soils out in the freezing temperatures and bundled up, still has a smile on his face. Cole's been great to work with. So just a quick outline about what I'll tell you. Oh, before I go through the outline, if I don't get to your question today, feel free to email me. I'm at marsh@iastate.edu. And if you are on the Twitter, you can follow us at soil_plant_IXNS. That's short for interactions. Our lab group and our research team studies soil-plant interactions and how to understand those interactions and make agriculture more regenerative and sustainable. So contact me through those ways if we don't get to your question today. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, a brief outline. I'm going to go through a background on the STRIPS project, what the acronym actually stands for. Some of you might be familiar with it already. And then our focus within the broader STRIPS team was to look at how the prairie strip is affecting three major components in the landscape. Soils directly underneath, and I'll talk a little bit about why that might not be as clear as you might think it is. The adjacent soils, kind of surrounding those strips, and then how it's, and this is important to a lot of farmers, the bottom line, how it might be affecting adjacent crops, the corn and soybeans I mentioned, which the majority of our farmers in Iowa and many of the states that prairie strips are in are planting prairie strips between. Then I'll end with some take-home messages and then happy to open it up for questions. Like I said, I wanted to explain the acronym. Not all of you might be familiar with what STRIP stands for. It's the Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. This is an overhead picture. The logo is on the left. I really like the logo that Lisa Schulte-Moore and others team developed earlier in the stages before I arrived at Iowa State. And this photo is an overhead photo showing prairie strips are kind of the oblong shapes. And then in the foot slope of these catchments are filter prairies as well. So this is the original strip site that was at Neil Smith. I'll describe a little bit in more detail in just a moment, and the experiment we did. But the first phase of strips, excuse me, we call strips 1, happened here at this Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge near Prairie City, Iowa. It was established in 2007, the long-term experiment of these paired watersheds, some that have prairie strips and some that don't. And then in 2014, what we call strips 2 started with commercial farmers using those. The picture I showed on my title slide, that was from a commercial farm. And now we've counted at least 88 farms that are protected and have a prairie strip in up to this point. Another kind of recent important milestone is the strips became part of the Conservation Reserve Program in 2018, part of the practice CP, Conservation Practice 43, CP 43. And now, again, to our count, we've got prairie strips in 15 states, 15,000 acres of prairie strips planted, and that's protecting 150,000 acres because that's kind of our recommended proportion of strips, about 10% planted per every field. Okay, so what is the deal with strips? Why is it growing in such interest? Why are farmers clamoring about it? Why are you here listening to this talk? The main idea is that prairie strips have disproportional benefits. So yes, a farmer might have to take 10% of a land out of production, out of corn and soybean production. I'll talk about some other uses of prairie strips, but you take 10% of the land out of production, plant it in native prairie species, 25 species or so mixes. And then from the strips 1 findings, this was kind of the earlier phase of research, we found that having those prairie strips in place had a 37% reduction in runoff, water runoff, 95% less reduction in sediment loss. If you don't believe me, sometimes photos speak louder than statistics. The photo on the left is what's called an H flume. These are put out there by Dr. Matt Helmer's group. The one on the left that's buried in soil is a control with no prairie strip in it. And the one on the right is a prairie strip field. And you can see there's a little bit of sediment in it, but the water's clear. You can actually see the water coming out. So we've documented that already. We've documented that prairie strips reduce the surface phosphorus loss that comes off the field in these H flume, 77% reduction, 38% less total nitrogen loss. So we're keeping nutrients, we're keeping soil in the field. There's 72% less nitrate in groundwater and many other benefits that I won't go into. I just focused on kind of the soil and water quality aspects. But some researchers we're working with are looking at using prairie strips as a pollinator habitat. So bringing out honeybee boxes, using them for grazing and all other purposes. Here's another photo, prairie strips surrounded by soybeans here in this field. And I just want to kind of highlight the 3 main questions. So that was the established research before we joined the prairie strips team. And we were really curious around 3 major questions that I alluded to in my my outline slide. One, we wondered, is the prairie, the regenerating or restoring a prairie, having the same effect of restoring a large tract or a large swath of land to either CRP or restored prairie? Do you get the same increases in soil health, increases in soil carbon, other soil ecosystem services under it? Because we might affect or we might expect such a narrow strip surrounded by agriculture might not have the same benefits. Just to make a long story short, we found out it did. That the increases in soil carbon are comparable to large swaths of restored prairie. We see more stable soils. We see greater infiltration rates, all these other soil health benefits that people have found when you restore large swaths of contiguous prairie, right? Not just in a narrow strip. And the strips are usually 10 to 20 feet wide. Now our second question that I will go into a little bit more is we were wondering how the prairie strip might affect the adjacent soils nearby, right? There's roots below ground. There's all these mechanisms I'll explain in just a moment why we think strips might be affecting the surrounding soils. And then if they're affecting the surrounding soils, it's likely that prairie strips might be affecting the surrounding crops and crop yield at the end of the year. So those last two questions, 2 and 3, are the ones we really focus on. And my student Cole Dutter did all the work on this, and with some collaboration from Michigan State folks too on some of the microbial measurements. And so here is this is kind of a very cartoonish black and white version, and you'll see why I've chosen black and white here, illustrating a prairie strip surrounded by corn, where we've got a view from below ground so we can see roots. The corn roots are a little exaggerated from this photo I have. They're probably not as big as some of those prairie plants. In fact, we know they're not as big. There's also, we know at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, there's about 5 to 14% slopes. So that's why I have it sloped here. And these are the ways we might, or we hypothesize that prairie strips might be affecting the surrounding crops and soils. One, we already know this from the water leaving the watershed. We know that it's altering landscape hydrology. So it's probably slowing water down once it hits the strip, greater infiltration rate, maybe changing the proportion of water that leaches to groundwater versus kind of lateral flow water. All these changes we don't really understand, but we know it's altering landscape hydrology. The perennial vegetation could be changing microclimate around the edges where the crop is, so changing the humidity, reflectance of light, all these properties that ag meteorologists look into. We know from the previous research at the watershed scale that the strips are slowing down and preventing sediment and immobile nutrients, so we probably get this backstop of nutrients at the top edge of the strip. Mobile nutrients will probably still move through the strip somewhat, but be lessened, and the strip might the prairie strip might act as kind of a sponge, both because of the plant uptake of mobile nutrients, but also just because of maybe increased water holding capacity and immobilization. We actually, folks at Michigan State have published this already, but they've seen that there's some beneficial fauna that can kind of creep out into the surrounding cropland, predatory beetles. We know that the increases habitat for birds and pollinators. There also could be negative effects. So we could have some pests like a caterpillar shown here. We could have weeds that kind of migrate out of, especially if the prairie is not taken care of, you can have weeds that kind of migrate out. Some studies have looked into this weed question, and it doesn't seem to be a big player if farmers are doing best management practices to control weeds around the strips. The other way that I'm kind of interested in, since I'm a soil scientist and I think a lot about roots too and fungi, is that there might be what I call root intrusion from the prairie plants. So roots kind of moving out into the cropland, and maybe even more so. We know this, and I'm not a fungal ecologist, but tree fungal hyphae and mycelium can grow miles long, and so we might expect there to be some reach out from the prairie strips of these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Another way, kind of more biochemical way, is that the vegetation that's staying there in the prairie strip might leach dissolved organic carbon, dissolved organic nitrogen. That could be affecting nutrient and crop dynamics downslope of the prairie as well. And then aerial dispersal. My colleague at Michigan State, she studies microbes, and she's proposed that maybe there's aerial dispersal of microorganisms and other mechanisms that we just haven't explained here. But you can see from this kind of collage of colors over here that there's just a lot of mechanisms and ways that prairie strips can be affecting the adjacent cropland and soils. Okay, let's talk a little bit about data. I've given you some of the background. Let's talk about the methods and data. So my student Cole, he sampled at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. This is near Prairie City, Iowa. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend going to it. They have a nice visitor center. You could see bison in prairies. There's actually remnant prairies there. They also have elk grazing in the area, not on our prairie strips, but in other parts of the park. We did an intensive study in 2019 and 2020 where we sampled at these yellow dots, and this is a prairie strips with the adjacent dots. We sampled upslope and downslope. And that just shown in that inset graph. But we did this at 3 paired watershed, total of 6 watersheds. One watershed had prairie strips, one didn't. We did it in the soybean and corn years that were planted that year. Then we also went back to the early days of the strips experiment and looked at yield monitor data just surrounding the prairie strip or adjacent above upslope and downslope, and then a similar soil type in the control field to compare to see if strips were affecting crop yield. That was kind of our major question with the yield monitor data. Okay, let's jump into it. So soil adjacent to prairie strips, let's see what we found. So nitrate, a mobile nutrient. Let me walk you through this graph because I'm going to show you some that look like this in the next few slides I show. So on the x-axis or the bottom here, this is the distance from prairie strip in meters. And if you don't think in meters like I often do for international scientists, 1 meter is about 3 feet or 3.3 feet. And we measured all the way up from 3 meters above the slope down to 9 meters. The prairie strip is at 0. So this line where I've got the prairie strip here, and then this is nitrate nitrogen in milligrams per kilogram. And the prairie strip are the blue triangle dots. So we have a total of 9. There are 3 pseudo replicates in each of the 3 watersheds for each treatment, a strip or control. And the solid blue line is the prairie strip, and the red dash line is going through the average of the control. And what you probably noticed there is that prairie strips reduced nitrate. This was in the soybean year. It actually didn't affect it in the corn year, probably because the farmer we work with down there, Gary, was adding plenty of nitrogen for the corn crop, sufficient nitrogen based on fertility tests. So we saw this depletion in nitrate for soybean. It's probably not a big deal. Soybean, we'll look at the yields in just a moment. I mentioned the immobile nutrients. So phosphorus is more immobile. Potassium is a little more mobile, not quite as mobile as nitrogen. Same thing, but now we've got multi-panels, and I'm showing you both the soybean and corn years. Soybeans on the left, corn is on the right panels, and then phosphorus is on top and potassium is on the bottom. And what we found here is that as we kind of predicted and hypothesized, the upslope soils were accumulating these nutrients, right? So right where that 0 line is, you see the bump in the blue solid line and all the blue triangles where phosphorus, and this is, I should say, this is not total phosphorus. This is malic 3 extracted or kind of plant available phosphorus that's probably attached to moving sediments is accumulating upstrip. So we're not losing those nutrients. That's a good thing. One of the interesting findings that our colleagues from Michigan State found, so using our same soils this time, and these graphs are kind of complex, but I'll walk you through this. These are a non-metric multi-dimensional scaling, and these units are arbitrary, so don't worry about the units. Just look at the dots in there. So the control are kind of the pinkish red. That's what the locations that didn't have a prairie strip. And then the prairie strip closest to the prairie strip is the dark blue. And then as you get further and further away from it out to 9 meters or about 20 feet, the lighter blue. And what we found is that with fungi, not bacteria, bacteria are the two panels on the left. So 2019, sorry, I don't know if you can see my pointer or not. 2019, 2020 years, fungi, we saw a different community. So this is a measure of how different the fungal species are, or the taxon, the groups of fungi. And we see that the prairie syrups are dramatically affecting it. It's very isolated, or they're grouping differently than the control. And we saw a somewhat weaker effect, but still some isolation or grouping compared to the control, or having no prairie strip. So the prairie strip is changing the fungal community composition, regardless of distance. Okay, so I'm going to pause a little bit just to take a sip of my tea here. But this was the question we were really worried about, because, you know, farmers are already taking a risk, taking 10% of their land out of production to plant a beautiful strip like this, even though you're getting all sorts of other ecosystem services. But we were really curious, is that prairie strip affecting the adjacent cropland? I've shown some evidence it's affecting the soils, the microbes, but now we wanted to really test to see if it's affecting the surrounding crops. And we have some evidence from some of the soil measurements we made that it might have a negative effect on yield. So these are similar graphs, the soybean in 2019 on the left, maize. This is the gravimetric water content, or just amount of water that's in the soil. And then this SPAD reading is the greenness of the leaves in the soybean or maize. And we saw in 2019, prairie strips reduced water by 6%. But we actually saw a slight increase in soybean SPAD. So the greenness downslope, where the effect of the decreasing water was the strongest, we also saw an increase in SPAD. So that was a little bit counterintuitive, but might indicate that there's lower available water because of the strip. Then in the maize, so in the corn yield, we saw that there was a decrease in maize greenness kind of surrounding the strip, in the less than a couple feet of the strip. We see this decrease in the greenness shown here. So we were thinking to ourselves, are we reducing yield? We're seeing it early. So I should mention and back up that the SPAD reading was taken when corn was at V8 to V10. Soybean, I think around reproductive stage, like R1, R2. And the only way we could test this was we wanted to look back at historical yield monitor data. So these little yellow boxes, those red spots are where we took the SPAD reading and we took the soil measurements. The yellow surrounding area is where we took the yield monitor data. And Luis Bentacor and Jared Nemi here at Iowa State in the statistics department helped us with this aspect of Cole's project. And here's some graphs shown here. The spoiler alert at the top, prairie strips don't affect the surrounding crop yield. So corn yields, and these are called density plots. So it just shows you the frequency. So the height of those peaks show you how often that yield occurs. So the mean is around 150 bushels per acre of corn, and just a little bit less for the prairie strip, but not significantly so. Soybean are almost identical, about 50 bushels per acre per year averaged from 2007 to 2020. And then these graphs below show the difference. So when you subtract the prairie strip yield from the control, if you see a strong swing one way or another for a paired watershed, you would see an effect. But these are both very close to zero. In fact, even when you take the average of the difference, it's less than a bushel for corn, but even less than half a bushel for soybeans. So very, very close. We conclude that prairie strips don't affect the adjacent or surrounding crop yield. So here's the take-home messages for you all. I didn't show you the data for this, but you'll have to take my word for it. The positive effects directly under the prairie strip are similar to previous studies on large swaths of restored CRP grassland or prairie restoration. The effects on the adjacent soil, yes, there seem to be some strong effects on adjacent soil. We showed you that with mobile, immobile nutrients, even gravimetric water content. We've got some other soil health properties that I didn't mention here. We showed that it was affecting the fungal communities. These seem to be neither positive nor negative, and might be contradictory in some cases. And then we showed that there was a somewhat slight effect early in crop growth on that reading of greenness, maybe even positive in soybean, but there was little to no effect on crop yield when we looked at the averages and even paired comparison between the control and the prairie strip. And at this time, I'm happy to take questions. Before I do that, I just want to put a plug in here. If you want to find out more about prairie strips, go to this website up here on the top right. You can also follow the cool stuff going on with prairie strips, the Iowa prairie strips and others. If you follow @prairie strips, and then my contact information is again down below there if I don't get to your question.
Thank you, Marshall. That's excellent information. We do have some questions in the chat, and there's a few more coming in. I think we can start with one from Eric.
Sure.
Would you recommend not including legumes in the strips to maximize uptake of nitrates flowing into and through the strips?
No, I think, legumes, forbs, having a good diverse mixture is a good thing. And I think the grasses are pretty aggressive, and we have legumes in the strips that we measured in. When you have enough of some of the tall grasses that have a high nitrate demand, and they will take up that nitrogen regardless of legume presence or not. It's a good question though. People are playing around with kind of seed mixtures. We haven't looked at kind of the environmental outcomes, but the more diverse you make those seed mixtures, usually it translates to more diverse established plants, as you probably wouldn't be surprised.
So the questions are rolling in.
Great, that's
Marshall,
good.
so
Yeah, keep them coming.
Shane has one. Has there been a paired comparison between diverse tall grass prairie strips and the traditional grass forage monocultures? And he also, PS, highly recommends visiting the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge.
I know Shane well. He is a former master student in our department. Yeah, I'm glad Shane put in the plug for Neil Smith too. So yeah, he was living in Ames here for at least a few years. And yeah, I don't think there has been a comparison, as he pointed out, a tall grass prairie and then like a grass forage monoculture. We put in a proposal, and we were thinking about, comparing these to grass waterways, which I think would fit Shane's description of like a grass forage monoculture. But grass waterways almost serve a different purpose. Rather than being perpendicular to the water flow, they're usually parallel to it. So it almost becomes like a slide rather than a stop, and moves the water off quickly and minimizes erosion in those like gullies and ditches, right? And I think a comparison like that would be really cool. I'll have to collaborate with Shane on that.
Okay, Olivia has a question. Are there issues with increased wildlife use, and how increased wildlife use can negatively affect crop yield?
Yeah, that was one of the, even though I didn't show a picture of a raccoon or a deer, that was one of our kind of hypotheses with the kind of I showed a picture of like a caterpillar that might prey on crops, so an insect. You can definitely see little deer wallows where they kind of press the grass down to kind of bed in. There's it's a wildlife refuge, which is actually one of the benefits of the prairie strips, right? There are people that can use this for hunting, and we haven't seen any evidence that it's increasing predation on the crops around it. Maybe because of the time of nesting and like when things are going on in the field. Our yield monitor data would have picked this up if there is, because it seems like those animals that Olivia brings up would probably be browsing nearest to the strip, I presume. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but we didn't see it in the yield monitor data.
Okay, Ann has a question, just looking for a timeline. How long were the prairie strips? How long had they been established when you started gathering results?
Yeah, so we sampled those soils in kind of a transect in 2019. And so about 12 and 13 years later after establishment. But the yield monitor data go back to the very first year they were established, so 2007.
So do you believe farmer attitudes will be a roadblock to adoption of this practice?
I mean, you never know. Farmers are people too. I think, there might be inherent biases. There are reasons to do it, to not to do it. But, we've seen the farmers who do it are really excited about it. They love having folks come out and visit it and do field days, hear more about the benefits of prairie strips. As I mentioned, there was some stuff I didn't even touch on. Some farmers are bringing out bee boxes and having people produce honey in the strips. There's all kinds of purposes that, we didn't even maybe, or I shouldn't say we, because it was my colleagues, Lisa Schulte-Moore and others that established it. Maybe they weren't thinking of benefits at that time that farmers are starting to see benefits of. We just we hear from the farmers that are excited about it and that end up doing it. And we keep track of on the website, the 15,000 acres of prairie strips and 150,000 acres of protected land. So yeah, I think if someone has a bias, they're going to find a way not to like the system, right? And it comes at a risk, right? You take 10% of your land out of production, but hopefully I've shown, at least just even from the summary slide, the disproportionate benefits you get from taking 10% out of production.
Can I assume that there's a cost share through the NRCS or the soil districts?
There is, yes, there is a cost share, and more information on that in the CP43 program.
Okay.
And on the STRIPS website.
Okay, very good. That's kind of a question I had initially to kind of offset that risk early on. So next question, is there a difference in placement for prairie strips compared to grass waterways?
Yeah, I was alluding to that. Maybe David had asked that question after I had mentioned this, but I'll just repeat it in case he didn't hear it or somebody else didn't. So there's two differences. Grass waterways are usually brome grass. They're low diversity, so they don't add the kind of plant diversity aspect that prairie strips do. But they're also aligned differently in the landscape. And their function is different. So prairie strips are usually almost act like a terrace without having to transform the landscape and pile up the soil to make a terrace. But the idea is to slow water flowing downhill, whereas a grass waterway is designed for that vegetation rather than to be stiff like a lot of the stems are in these prairie species. That grass and grass waterways just kind of bends over, creates this slide so that the water, surface water, is transported off the field without taking soil in that gully with it. So they're both important conservation practices. So hopefully that, but they serve different functions. And we have some of our strips too farmers have prairie strips and grass waterways in place, and they kind of intersect each other.
Very good. What was the mix of prairie grasses?
The mix on a lot of these photos I showed, including the one, is usually 20 to 25, I think usually like 25, 26 species mix. That includes forbs, grasses, legumes.
Do you have an estimated cost to establish a strip?
I don't. I wish I had that. We have some extension documents on that. Okay. And there's I usually get the question too, if somebody hasn't asked it already. We recommend mowing and or burning the first couple years. A lot of these species are dependent on kind of grazing or disturbance, slower growing. And so these farmers that have these really fantastic looking strips, they put a little bit of effort in that regard too. So mowing the first few years, burning so often. You can find out more about those management details. And sorry, I don't have that number, that costs off the top of my head, but if that person emails me, if they can't find it on the website, I can find out for them.
Okay, was time ever discussed as a factor for the farmer? For instance, having to work around the strips?
You know, I'm not sure. We've got a colleague that's he's a rural sociologist, and he does a lot of these farm interviews and looks at farm perspectives. I can ask him what he's learned from farmer adoption or non-adoption of strips, and that might be one of the kind of perceived drawbacks, is maybe not the time itself, but just a hassle of kind of farming around the strip itself.
So would you recommend installing strips on the contour, or have you not seen any significant difference on straight through the field?
We've got, so to be determined. So there are some very flat experimental plots at Michigan State. So Nick Haddad is the director of the Kellogg Biological Station there, and he and his colleagues established some prairie strips, and they're looking at some of the same things we are, and other aspects of prairie strips on a very flat landscape. And in that case, the orientation doesn't matter much, but if you have a sloped field, one of the biggest benefits of it is the slowing of the water and preventing that sediment runoff. So in other words, to answer that contour, it's best if you have a sloped field to plant it in the contour, right?
How has the impact on pollinators been measured in this practice? Specifically thinking about farmers that will continue to use pesticides even with this practice.
Yeah, and I wish I could remember the results from these studies. There have been some great collaborators that have worked on this question. And if that person emails me, the person that asked about the pollinators, I can put them in contact either directly with the people or find their publications, including, I think they have some extension publications. But they've done some research on this by collecting pollinators, looking at insecticides on insects, in the pollen, in the honey. They've done some very thorough investigations. So Dr. Amy Toff, Matt O'Neill here at Iowa State, they've been diving into that question. I'm sorry, I'm not a pollinator expert. I'm a simple soil scientist. But I can put you in contact with those people to give you a little bit more information about what they found. I think the gist of it is that they're, with proper insecticide management, it doesn't seem to be an issue of insecticide drift into the strip.
Okay, Ralph has the question, what is the minimum width needed to be effective for water infiltration effects?
Yeah, we tested, and by we, again, I mean my colleagues earlier in the days, they were testing the proportion of a field being put into prairie, so 10 versus 20. And what they found is that 20% of the field being in in a prairie was enough to get the benefits. And the width would really depend then on the size of the field. But on average, as I mentioned, they're usually between 10 and 20. But that's an experiment we haven't done yet. We haven't looked at how narrow they'd have to be to get those benefits. And I imagine there probably is at least for the water runoff, a diminishing return, meaning the wider and wider you make it, you're not getting any further improvement in sediment runoff. So in other words, to answer the question, I don't know what that minimum is, but it's something that we'd like to explore in the future.
Okay, John is just giving you kudos for a really great presentation, and one of his comments is that that farm might lease that land for hunting, and he would pay more for it with that practice in place. And it's a thank you. Ralph has, is it feasible to convert grass strips into prairie strips? Oh,
that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I think you could, but again, it gets at that difference in purpose of a grassed waterway versus the prairie strip being perpendicular to flow versus parallel or with it. Yeah, I think if you've got that strip already and you want it, I mean, well, if that grass waterway ends up being kind of the edge of a field and goes into a nearby waterway, there has been some research on what we call foot slope strips, or just, kind of rather than being kind of further up in the field, they're at the bottom or the edge of the field, and those can be very beneficial, having that stiff upright vegetation rather than brome grass, and that just the diversity would be a benefit too. Man, these folks are asking some great questions.
They're still rolling in. They're still rolling in. So
It's a great group.
well, it's always a great group. We got a great presenter. I think you kind of touched on this, but any issues with herbicides killing off vegetation in the strips?
No, we haven't seen it. With the farmers that are doing this, they're pretty they're protective of their strip. They really take pride in it. And you can see a lot of how clean a lot of these edges are between the strip and the crop field. And yeah, with proper herbicide management, it's doable to have these in here and not have any kind of negative effects from the field.
Okay, here's one that I think you partially covered part of it, but I'll read it all. I might have missed it, but have you ever compared the soil water loss, water runoff to terraces? And also, have grazing the strips or stubble been considered to offset costs? Is it possible to make them compatible with grazing without decreasing effectiveness?
Yeah, those are two great questions. I don't think there's been a side-by-side comparison with terraces. I mean, there's a couple benefits with prairie strips, right? One of them is you get the plant diversity, but you also don't have to terraform, and I guess terraform is not the right word, but move land, pull a land mover out and kind of form the soil to make a terrace, which eventually erodes, and you have to redo, and many farmers have to redo these terraces every once in a while too. And so having a prairie strip in place is kind of an easier way to get maybe the same or equal benefit to a terrace. But to answer that question more directly, it hasn't been tested yet. But I guess I'm giving the benefit sides of doing a prairie strip rather than a terrace. What was the second part of that person's question?
About the grazing effects that might offset the cost if you graze, and how does that impact the effectiveness of that strip if it's being grazed?
This is another cool one, and I want to really get into this area of research, because I think we don't know very much about it in general. The hoof action and the chewing and pulling on the shoots of plants, and how that stimulates root growth and biological activity underground, and then also the economic benefit of being able to graze them. And I guess to answer the question, we haven't done a good comparison yet. There are people interested in it, farmers interested in it. We've talked about it. It's another kind of step further to restoring some function of the native prairie, right? Because you have to have ungulates back on the land grazing as well. But it would be one of those things we need to test, and I think it would be a very cool experiment to do. It's difficult though to do enclosed grazing and kind of compare it to non-enclosed. I think technology out there is getting better. There are these virtual fence collars that might make it possible in the near future. So that person that asked that question, they'll have to check back in with us a couple years from now to see if we've got some great grazing and prairie strip studies.
Okay, very good. Are the yield comparisons on a field basis or adjacent to the strips?
It's adjacent to the strip. So the original study by Lisa and my other collaborators that I had acknowledged earlier, they looked at just the field average, or the catchment average. They showed a slightly lower, but it was not significantly lower, kind of like what I showed. But we wanted to go in and actually take the yield monitor data and just pull out the yield monitor data that was near, or as this person asked, adjacent to the strips. And yeah, we found just that those yields adjacent to it were not significantly different, as I showed the data earlier.
Okay, so Stephanie put in a comment, I think, that answers the width question. It's 30 feet width for CRP, probably be eligible for CRP.
Okay.
So another question, impacts with other crops such as root crops for human food.
Like root crops planted in the prairie strips and like kind of like a U-pick situation. Would that person be able to clarify a bit more, or like root crops in the surrounding or the adjacent crops?
I guess we'd have to have them add in some clarification. So we'll go to the next one. Have you seen a reduction in herbicide and insecticide use by the farmers participating in the studies?
Oh, geez. I think there are folks working on this in the strips team. I think John Tyndall might be working on this, and some others looking at kind of enterprise budgets of the farmer strip fields and looking at things like that, like reduced inputs and how the inputs are changing with some of the what I called strips 2, or the more on-farm commercial farm. I don't know if he has an answer to that. I can point that person to John and see if he's got an answer to it yet. I haven't heard any updated research from him, but we're looking into it.
Okay, that is the last of the questions. I'd ask you to, well, there's a couple more just came in. Do you think different types of soils, as in Wisconsin, will affect the results?
Yeah, we have some strips in Wisconsin, and a colleague of mine, we wrote a proposal, didn't get funded, but I'm hoping that I think she might have gotten some funding anyways. Natasha Rain, she was looking at doing some strips research up in Wisconsin, and I don't know a lot of the research out of there yet and what they found, but it's another one of those things that I'm going to have to say to be determined. Check back in with us. Most the farms that my students studied were all in Iowa. I think the soils and climate are similar to enough that I don't think we'd see drastically different findings. That's just my hunch as a soil scientist, but I could be wrong, especially if the farming is different, if they've got an integrated dairy system or something.
Okay, there are farms in Montana that are planting prairie strips 150 feet wide.
Wow, that's a wide strip.
And then Stephanie adds in the 30 foot is the minimum for CRP in Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, I would imagine optimum width depends on many factors, including slope, soils, water movement. CRP in Minnesota's 30 to 120 feet. So let's stop with questions there, Marshall. I appreciate your presentation and the answering the questions. If you could stop sharing your screen, I'm going to share mine, and then I'm going to kind of introduce the topic for next time on February 15th. We're going to have Dr. Christine Sprunger, who's going to talk baseline assessment of soil health in Ohio. So again, I really appreciate, Marshall, your presentation and your patience answering those questions so thoroughly. We can now break in. We'll allow you to break into the breakout rooms if you'd like. If you'd like to rehear this again, this will be posted on the Soil Health Nexus website in the next couple of days. So if you want to re-listen. So with that, again, thank you so much, Marshall. We really appreciate your presentation today, and join us in one of the discussion rooms. So with that,
I'd love to.
Thanks everyone for joining us again today.